Okay. We're back for another week, but we're not back for another week in Genesis. Like I've said for the last 2.5 years. This is the first week, and we're going to take the first chapter of Exodus. So, changing the book, and I think that you will enjoy Exodus. There are a number of interesting things about it. There are a lot of interesting things about it. Exodus is a book about redemption. Ruth is a book about redemption. And in a different way, but still in the same way, the book of Revelation is a book about redemption. And again, I will conclude that if you don't understand reasonably Genesis and Exodus, it becomes very difficult to understand the book of Revelation. Okay? So now I want to spend a few minutes, hopefully a few minutes. Yeah. Doing an introduction for the book, because I think there are some unique things about this book. And so I'd like to point some of them out. Okay. Now, the Hebrew, if you had your Hebrew Torah and you looked at this book, you would see it's called Shema. Okay. Shemath occurs because of the first few words of the book. That is Exodus 1:1. Now these are the names. That is Shemath. So that's where they get, quote unquote, if you want to call it the title. Also, it's interesting that we don't have to turn here, but when we were in Genesis, actually in chapter 46, in verse 8, this is where the Lord shows the vision to Jacob after he's been told that he's supposed to leave Canaan and go to Egypt. And in verse 8, again, the exact same thing is said. And these are the names of the sons of Jacob who left to leave for Egypt. Okay? Exact same phraseology. Now, Exodus is the fulfillment in multiple ways of the Abrahamic covenant. It's specifically the fulfillment, and I'll read it to you. I'm going to go to Genesis 15. I'm going to read verse 13. And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. Okay? That's part of the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. There are other fulfillments also of the Abrahamic covenant that also occur in Exodus. And actually, we're going to see another part of it starting to be fulfilled tonight in the first chapter. Now, we call this book Exodus because in the Greek version of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, it is called, it's called Ex, or means out, and Hodas means the way. So Exodus, the way out. It's the way out in multiple levels, in this book for the children of Israel. Now, the date of Exodus has been disputed back and forth, up and down, side by side for hundreds of years. And there are elaborate schemes about what the dating must mean, and therefore under which Pharaoh it might occur, and so on and so. But I think there's an amazingly simple way to figure out the date of the book. Turn to 1 Kings. First Kings. And I want you to go to chapter 6. And I'm going to read verse 1. Now it came about In the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, that Solomon started to build the house of the Lord. Now, we know very well from many, many, many documents that the 4th year of Solomon's reign would have been 967 BC. So if you add 480 years to 967, you get 1447 BC. That is the date of when the children of Israel first started into Canaan. Okay, 1447 BC. This is also the same year of Jacob's vision that I just mentioned to you a few minutes ago in Genesis 46:8, where he's to leave Canaan. So, therefore, you find that if you add the 1447 BC and you add 430 years to that, the number of years they actually were in Egypt, you come to the year 1877 BC. Okay. This, of course, would have been the date that Jacob got this whole information started, okay, to leave Canaan. Now, the chapters are structured in the following way, okay? Chapters 1 through 6 talk about the enslavement of the people and the need for a release. That's the first approximately 6 chapters. Chapters 7 through 11 show God's power and might to provide the redemption they need. Chapters 12 through 18 speaks of the spiritual means of redemption, that is, the importance of the blood sacrifice and the Old Testament sacrificial system. Chapters 19 through 24 speak of the duty in our response to redemption, that is, obedient living. And the last 15 chapters, that is chapters 25 through 40, are an intricate illustration of redemption called the tabernacle and the laws concerning it. So there is a huge amount in this book that is typological, okay? A very large amount. Now, Exodus also is a book of many prophecies. You know, we often don't think of Exodus or books in the Torah as being prophetic, but being that we just got done going through every verse of Genesis, okay, we knew it was filled with prophetic elements, right? Mm-hmm. Filled with them. Well, so is Exodus. So let me give you a few of them. There will be many of them, okay? One example is the burning bush, the intense light of God that is never consumed, which is an illustration of the Messiah. What do we read in Matthew 17 at the Mount of Transfiguration? That when he went up to the mount, what did he look like? He was so brilliant, it said that no launderer could ever possibly make a garment that was more white. He emulated over and over again a brightness that hardly could be looked at, right? So the Old Testament beginning of it was the burning bush, and the New Testament fulfillment of it in one place, I think there's another place of its fulfillment, is in the Mount of Transfiguration. Okay. Also, we're going to talk about the prophetic elements of the powerful plagues of Egypt, which we will hopefully one day learn are extremely typological of the very same powerful plagues brought upon the earth by the Lord in the book of Revelation in the last 7 years of earth history, at least 7 years before Christ returns of earth history. Now, also, there's the typology, an extremely important one, of the Passover. Mm-hmm. it's almost hard to put stronger words on how important that typology is. You have the Lamb of God who is killed and his blood is spilled and is publicly displayed on the doorposts, the lintels, for what? As the typological element of the forgiveness of sins. Okay. And of course, there's many, many applications of that, Old and New Testament. Now, you also have the typological elements of the seven feasts. Okay. Now, we haven't studied that here ourselves very much, but let me just read something to you. A very important verse that's often overlooked in Genesis. It's in chapter 1. You don't have to turn there, but I'm going to read it. It's verse 14. God's talking about the calendar he set up. God says he set his own calendar up. Okay. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for the signs and seasons and days and years." The word signs is the word Moedim. Okay. Moedim in the Old Testament are the festival days. Therefore, God is saying that the festival days are not only important elements and rituals in and of themselves, but they are also eschatological. That is, they are also talking about God's plan in history for the future using those seven festival days. So that's another element. Also, of course, the nature of the tabernacle. This is the blueprint of Christ's redemptive work down to every imaginable element. And certainly when we get there, we'll go through those things. Two verses that I think are important, they're often overlooked in the New Testament. I'm going to read them to you. The first one I'm going to read is in Romans 15. And I wish people that read the New Testament read these verses better. Romans 15. Verse 14. He says, let's see if I have it right. Is it 15? Maybe I picked the wrong. Okay, I'm sorry. It's verse 4, not 14. I said it wrong. So it's Romans 15:4. For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction. Whose? Old Testament saints or New Testament saints?
Everyone's.
New Testament saints, for our instruction, as Paul writes, okay? That through perseverance and the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. Okay? In other words, everything that was written in the Old Testament has some form of applicability to the New Testament, which I think should make you ask a question. Why don't very many churches teach the Old Testament? Since the verse says everything about it talks about its application of fulfillment in the New Testament. And also, another verse that I want to point out is in 1 Corinthians 10. So I'm going to turn over a little bit here to the right. 1 Corinthians 10, and it's verse 11. Paul says, speaking of the Old Testament in verse 10, okay? He's just describing elements of it. And he says in verse 11, now these things happened to them. Who's them? The Old Testament saints, okay? As an example, and they were written for whose instruction? Our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages that come. Therefore, I think those are two verses that strongly state, at least unless I'm misinterpreting them, that if you read the New Testament, you should be reading the Old Testament and seeing how it applies and see how the Old Testament is fulfilled in the New. All right. Okay, now, the Exodus also, the book is a theological model for lots of things. I'll give you a few of them. It talks about the identity of the believer to Israel, and therefore the model typically of what we see is the tendency towards the bondage to sin. That's one of the theological elements of it. It also it is a theological model because it demonstrates Egypt as a typology of the world system that, of course, the New Testament believers we live in, right? Thirdly, it is also a model of Pharaoh as he is typologically and acts typologically as a satanic figure. And it talks about all of his strategies against Israel, which are the similar ones to the strategy the devil has against us also as New Testament believers. Okay. Also, obviously, the main figure, very quickly, it's going to be the main figure, Moses. Moses is typological of God's deliverer, that is, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And the Exodus narrative is also typological of God's prophetic future and the end of the age. Those are just a few of the things that are included in this book that we're now beginning to study. Now, again, adding on to the statement about Moses, we see constant images in Exodus of Messiah's future work. As I said, Moses as a deliverer, the burning bush as Messiah's radiant nature, and even, I think, one of its fulfillments, which I'm going to turn here. I'm going to turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 10. Think of the burning bush, and I'm going to read this. It's verse 1 of Revelation 10. And I saw another, quote, strong angel. Be careful with that phrase because I think you have to be careful how to interpret it. I saw another strong angel coming down out of heaven, clothed with a cloud, and the rainbow was upon his head, and his face was like the sun opened. And he placed his right foot on the sea and his left on the land. Who do you think this angel was? Messiah. Okay. Remember, what is in the Old Testament? What is Jesus called over and over and over and over and over again? The angel of the Lord, the angel of the Lord, not an angel of the Lord, the one and only. Okay. The other angels are different because they're created. But again, I think we see the fulfillment of this burning bush element right here and also being fulfilled in Revelation 10:1.
So the angel of the Lord, what's the original word? Elohim?
Well, it depends, it's, I'm trying to think right now in the Hebrew. It's Malak, is it Malak Elohim? I think.
Mm-hmm.
The angel of the Lord. I think that's what it is. Malak Elohim. Okay. So you try to get me on that one. Now, I want to also spend just a few minutes on something that I couldn't avoid doing. Okay. And that is asking this question. What is the historical, archaeological, the Jews in Egypt and the Exodus from Egypt? Now, this has been debated by theologians over and over and over again. And you find persistently that liberal theologians, which are the vast majority in the world today, deny the reality of the Exodus.
And that's sad.
They say that it's either mythological or it's simply symbolic, but they rarely will ever say it's historically true. Okay? Now, we, of course, as New Testament believers of the Word of God, okay, in believing in the Word of God, realize this is foolish. So let me give you some examples, okay? First, there is a very famous bas-relief found at the tomb of the governor of Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II was Pharaoh, and his main governor, okay, in that man's tomb, okay, we see an interesting thing, okay? That is, we see a bas relief of men with beards in funeral procession with the inscription beneath in Egyptian calling them Amu Shu, which translated from Egypt means Canaanites. Now, remember, what's one of the reasons why the Egyptians did not like Canaanite peoples, Semitic peoples? There were two big ones. One, because they wore beards.
And they were sheep herders.
And they were sheep herders. Okay. So here we see a bas relief of all of these men who are bearded. Okay. And of course, this description of them, the Canaanites. Okay. Evidence that there were obviously these Semitic people in Egypt. Now, secondly, there's a interesting huge boulder called the Famine Stele. The Famine Stele. Inscriptions on its surface. It's found, and I think it's still, well, I don't know if they've removed it or not. Maybe it's in the British Museum now, but it was found on this Sahel Island, which was in the middle of the Nile River, which tells the story of famine in Egypt. In that stele, it states that the famine was 7 years in length, where the people struggled for lack of grain, and that a Pharaoh's dream predicted a return to plenty after 7 years of famine. That's pretty interesting. Okay. Which of course we note the Pharaoh's dream in Genesis 41 about this very same thing. So again, the very elements of Genesis, that last part about Joseph, are exactly mimicked in this stele that was found archaeologically. Now, thirdly, there's this place called the Tomb of Rekhmire, and it shows paintings of Semitic-looking people making mud bricks from clay using basins of water and straw. That's interesting. Of course, that's exactly what we're going to read in a few minutes in Exodus chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Also, there are a variety of copper mines around in the Sinai Desert. Okay. In other words, the very, very southern end of the Negev, that area of territory between the very northern part of Egypt and the very southern part of Israel. And of course, we have archaeological evidence that Israeli archaeologists have looked at for years now in those copper mines, to you. In verse 38, it says about when they were leaving Egypt. Okay. It says, now the sons of Israel, I'll start in 37. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from the children. Verse 38, and a mixed multitude also went up with them, along with the flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. You see what it says? Mm-hmm. The word in Hebrew is Areb Rab. and it means a mixed company or a mongrel race, or another way to put it, which is put many times used in the Old Testament, is, quote, aliens and strangers living inside the territory. Okay, so just like the papyrus says there were these people, the text in the 12th chapter of Exodus also says there was a combined group of people. It wasn't just Hebrews, okay, that left during the Israeli Exodus. Okay. There's tons of evidence, okay, all kinds of historical documents in Egypt, okay, about this. But I gave you enough to give you the idea that there's plenty of archaeological historical documentation. Okay, now let's go back to chapter 1 and read the first 7 verses and start to talk about them. Exodus 1:1 through 1:7. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, and all the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Okay, now we have this listing of these sons. 11 of them are named. Why are 11 named? Because the 12th one is named in verse 6. Okay, that is, Joseph was already in the land. Okay, so he's the 12th. They're named in a different birth order. Okay, they're named in the birth order first of the Leah, and then Rachel, and then the 2 concubines. That's the way the order is named in this particular case. Okay, now I'm going to turn for a moment all the way to the end of the Old Testament, to the book of Hosea. I'm going to read you a verse because I think it applies to this very text that we're talking about. And it's Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. It says, "When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son," or sometimes people make that plural, sons. Okay, so in other words, what he's saying is these 12 sons that are mentioned that leave Canaan and come into Egypt were the generation that was the youth of Israel. Okay, the first 70 people, the first 12 sons as tribal leaders, they were the youth of Israel. Okay. And of course, they end up, as we said, as we've gone over, being 70 people who left for Egypt. Now, as I stated in verse 5, this list excluded Joseph and his 2 sons, okay, Ephraim and Manasseh, who already were living in Egypt. Therefore, as I said last week, also, when we were doing the last chapter of Genesis, you have 70 people. That is 7 times 10, the perfect number of individuals that leave Canaan, okay, that become the nucleus for the creation of the nation. Now, we know, and it's alluded to and said back in verse 6, and Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. Okay, so Joseph died. We know when he died. He was 110 years old when he died. We learned that in Genesis. Okay. Now, also, eventually his 11 brothers died too. Okay. Right.
Mhm.
So this is the first generation with their direct children. They actually were in the first generation that's created inside Egypt. If you will turn also to the New Testament and go to the 7th chapter of the book of Acts, this is a history given by the martyr Stephen. Stephen's history in Acts 7. And I want you to look at chapter 7, verse 17. But as the time of the promise was approaching, which God had assured to Abram, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt. Okay? So here we see an interesting statement. And another one also with it too. Verse 18. I'm going to talk about both these. And verse 18 says, until there arose another king over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. Okay? Now, here's the significance of this. Okay? That is this fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise, which of course was being fulfilled, especially that component of the promise that is found in Genesis 13. And I think it's verse 16. Let me read it to you. Genesis 13:16. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. In other words, there are many components of the Abrahamic promise. It was a territory, it was a nation, it was numerous, it was described as the dust of the earth and the stars of the sky. Okay, as God described it to Abraham. And so this portion of that promise is being fulfilled. That is, they're going to be made as numerous as the dust of the earth when they're in Egypt. Okay, this is the place where it's going to be fulfilled. Now, in verse 7, back in our text in Exodus, it says, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Okay? Now, because I am a nerd, I had to do something. Okay? And that is, I had to figure out what the formula for population growth was and put the numbers in and see what was produced. So, not that you have to write this down, but I'm going to tell you what the formula is for population growth. Okay? Population growth is P, population growth, equals P to the little o. That means P to the little o is the starting population number you begin with. Okay? Times the constant E. E is a mathematical constant. It's always 2.718. Okay? And that is put to the power of the rate of growth times the time of duration. So I'll put these numbers together. So the population, therefore, equals 70 times 2.718 to the power of 2.57% times 430 years. Okay? Believe me, it works out. Okay? Now, so 2.57% times 430 years, that exponent, okay? If you multiply it out, the exponent adds up to 11.051. So it's to the power of 11.051. So our number is P, population, okay? Okay. It is 70 times this number times its exponent. The number times its exponent, that is 2.718, to the 11.015 power is the number 62,935. Okay? Therefore, the population is 70 times 62,935, which ends up being 4,405,450 people.
49.
Okay. Okay.
Really?
Now, this assumes the following things. It assumes that a very average growth rate for the population, 2.57%. We know from all kinds of study that population growth usually averages anywhere from 1 to 4% a year. But here we used a middle number, 2.57%. Okay. Number two, it assumes a fertility rate of 6 to 8 children per family. Okay. Number three, it assumes an average death rate. Okay. And it also says that this occurs, that is, the time that it's going to take to do this is 430 years. Now, remember, we've talked about Numbers 26:51 a bunch of times. That's the verse which says that after 40 years of the wilderness wanderings, there were 601,730 men aged 20 or above who were ready to go into the conquest. Okay? Remember, I went through that number. I factored it for you. I'm not going to do that again. But, so therefore, the 601,730 does not include wives of those men, wives of those men who are older than that. Okay? It does not include the children they had or older people, and it does not include whatever number of the mixed company of Canaanites that were also slaves. It doesn't include that number. So if you add all those people together, it's not hard to believe that you could have 2 to 4 million people at the end of 430 years in Egypt. Okay, the numbers work, is all I'm saying. So I'm done with being a nerd for the moment. But I had to do it to verify that the statistics demonstrate it's workable. Okay, now let's read back to chapter 1. Let's read verses now 7 through 14. Who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply in the event of war, and they also join themselves to us and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted the Jews, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. And the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously. And they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. Okay? So let me talk about these verses. Now, I mentioned these couple verses in Acts 7, and I'm going to read it again. I'm going to read verse 18. Okay? Here's the verse in Acts 7. Until there arose another king over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. Okay? Now it's interesting. Another is actually in two forms in the Greek. Remember, we're talking about Acts written in Greek. There's two forms. One form is heteros, and another form is allos. Okay? Allos means another grab this pair, of similar type or nature, okay? And heteros means another of a similar type, but different nature. So in other words, it would be like, heteros would be like if you're talking about writing implements and you talk about there's a pen and a pencil. That would be heteros. They're both writing instruments, but they actually are different from one another. That's the word that's used here when it says a new Pharaoh. Okay? He is heteros. He is different nature from the one that Joseph knew. Okay? Therefore, that Pharaoh had no motivation to benefit, bless, protect, or honor the Hebrews like Joseph's Pharaoh did. And this becomes the reason for what's going to occur as we see it in these next verses. It also says in verse 19 of Acts 7, it says, it was he who took shrewd advantage of our race and mistreated our fathers so that they would their infants and they would not survive. Okay? Now, the word shrewd advantage is the Greek word kadasoph id, exceedingly deceptive, and to make a devious plan. That's what the Greek word means. Therefore, this new Pharaoh constructed a very complex and devious plan of how he was going to deal with what he considered to be the threat of the Jews in his land. Now, in verses 9 and 10, back in chapter 1, it says that because of this large growth and multiplication of numbers that occurred with the Jews, that and also probably adding the foreign people living in the land too, that there was a significant number of people that threatened the Pharaoh. Okay? Why did he threaten the Pharaoh? Because, of course, they said, let's go back to the text in chapter 1. Says, come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply in the event of war. They also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us. In other words, what he's saying is that these Jews and also the other Canaanite slaves that lived in Egypt, that if an external enemy was able to ally with them, then they would overwhelm Egypt. They would have to fight a battle within and a battle without. So therefore, they decided they were going to take care of this potential problem by the enslavement of these people. So, in verses 11 through 14, the Egyptians organized the Hebrews into large labor camps. Verse 11 says, they were headed by harsh taskmasters who used various types of building projects, okay? Used them in various types of building projects. It included what are called in the text storage cities, and it locates two of them, but there's probably plenty more in Ramses and Pithom. And we learn, actually, if we look at Egyptian history, that these facilities not only stored food, but also stored weapons and supplies for future warfare. In other words, some of them were cities of armories of weapons. Okay? Isn't it interesting? They're threatened by the Jews because they're afraid they're going to be used as warriors against them, and then the Jews are used as labor to make these armories to fill with weapons. Rather interesting plan, isn't it? Okay. Now, it states in verse 12 that despite the cruel and harsh treatment, because of the truth of the Abrahamic covenant and its promise about multitudes and multitudes, that the Hebrew birth rate continued despite all of these efforts to increase. Okay? The word there in Hebrew is rabbah, and it means to multiply and become very numerous. Therefore, Pharaoh and his advisors had to come up with another idea. In verses 13 and 14, they decided to double down. And how did they do it? Okay. They increased the intensity of the harshness in these projects and made these people labor both in mortar and bricks. And also, they also organized them into field labor groups that appeared for several reasons, not the least of which was to grow straw and other chaff that were used to make bricks, and also probably was used, that is, the field work was used to raise crops that the slaves themselves ate so that it wouldn't take away from what the Egyptians ate. So they also were out in the field and they're digging clay to, of course, make these bricks. So it's a huge agricultural operation, both to make the elements, dig the elements, grow the elements for building the clay bricks, and also for production of food. Now, the problem is, okay, or this program, I'm sorry, had a threefold purpose, not just one, threefold. Number one, the obvious, to utilize the labor to benefit the Egyptians in these projects. That's the obvious one. But there's two more.
Kill them in the process.
Right. Number two, to subject the Hebrews into enslavement so that they could not be used as a military threat and would be physically weakened. That's a second purpose. And then there was a third purpose. It was an intentional, progressive genocide, attempting to reduce their population and shrink the number of Hebrews inside Egypt so that they would no longer be much of a threat. So there were three purposes in this program. Okay.
That's the devil's program.
It's the devil's program. Absolutely. Now, back to our text. We're going to read 15 through 22, and then we'll conclude this first chapter tonight. So, it says, and the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other one was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then you shall let her live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the boys live? In other words, directly disobeyed him. And they give a very interesting answer. Verse 19. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are so vigorous that they give birth before the midwife can get to them. Interesting excuse.
So sometimes it's okay to lie.
Yeah. And then verse 20 and 21, 22. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. And it came about because of that the midwives feared God, that he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born, every son who is born, you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. Okay, so let's finish these last verses and see what's going on here. So, the initial program did not work. That is, work them to death, and so that they just die out. Okay, that doesn't work. So, a new one is devised, and it's even more aggressive program of genocide than the first one was. Okay, it's active genocide. So, it speaks about two midwives, and it calls their name Shiphrah and Puah. Now, I'm certain that there were two midwives with this name, but I'm not certain that, well, number one, there were way more midwives than these two. Probably they were the heads of the midwife program for the Jews in Egypt. Okay? Call them the main headwives or the teaching headwives or whatever.
Charge nurse.
Charge nurse, right, exactly, on the unit. But I think their names, the meaning of their names is really quite indicative of something important. Okay? And that is the name of Shifra means to glisten, sparkle with light. Okay? And the name Pua means brilliance. Therefore, I think they're typological of what God does for the Jews despite everything that Pharaoh tries to do. That is, they're going to end up being blessed and God's light will shine upon them. And also they will show God's brilliance and his protection of them to the world around. Now, I think the meaning of their names shows the activity of God through these two and others like them. And that is that despite the intended curse, what does it lead to? Rather, a blessing. Okay? Now, Pharaoh's plan was to, upon the act of active delivery, okay, to take the Hebrew boys, okay, and to kill them. And this was supposed to occur, and let me show you the word again here, okay. It's in verse 16. When you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and you see them upon the birth stool. Now, I found this to be an interesting word because it means two different things, right? And I think both of them are very interesting in their application. The first meaning of birth stool, the word in Hebrew is oben, birth stool, okay? And what it meant was, it meant two stones of a possibly circular type that the mother would sit upon, her bottom would sit upon them, her legs down to then give birth. Okay, that's one meaning of it, probably the literal meaning of it. But the other word for oben, Hebrew, means a potter's wheel. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Well, a potter's wheel is a place where clay is formed into things, isn't it? Okay. Think of the statement in Romans 11, where I think it's in 11, where Paul talks about the clay that God uses, he makes for desirable and undesirable purposes, right? Now, I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 27. And I'm going to give you what I'll call a suggested idea that you can ponder about this whole idea of the potter's wheel. Matthew 27. And I'm going to read verses 6 through 10. And the chief priests took the pieces of silver and said, "It is not lawful to put them into the temple treasury, since it is the price of blood." What are we talking about here? The 30 pieces of silver that Judas, upon his regret, threw back into the Pharisees in the temple, okay, not wanting it anymore. Verse 7, and they counseled together with the money bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers, non-Jews, indigent people who died in Israel that weren't Jews. Okay, they were buried there. Okay, verse 8, and for this reason that field is also called the field of blood to this day. All right, obvious reason. The blood of Christ was on the hands of Judas, who ended up being buried there. Verse 9. Now here's the interesting part, I think. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord had directed. The potter's field is also called in other areas the field of clay. Because what do you dig out to put on the potter's wheel? So it was also called the field of clay. All right. Now, it's a place in which clay was extracted and used to make things. Excuse me, I'm going to grab my last notes here. So they bought this burial ground for these strangers, and it fulfills a very interesting prophecy. Okay. It wasn't cited here in Matthew 27, but I'm going to read it to you. It's in Jeremiah. So if you want to turn back, if you want to, go to the book of Jeremiah and go to chapter 18. Jeremiah 18. I'm going to read verses 3 through 6. This is a prophecy that Jeremiah gives. Okay. Then I went down to the potter's house, and there he was making something on his wheel. Okay. Clay, potter's wheel again, right? But the vessel that he was making of clay was spoiled in the hand of the potter. So he remade it into another vessel as it pleased the potter to make. Sound at all familiar with Romans? Okay. God takes two lumps of clay, making one way and one the other way. Okay. One for destruction and one for honor. Verse 5. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, verse 6, can I not, O house of Israel, deal with you as this potter does, declares the Lord? Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. And then I'll even read 7. And at one moment I might speak concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom to uproot, to pull down or destroy. Now, here's what I think the typological application is. These Jewish women sit on this bench, which is also called the potter's wheel, same word in Hebrew. And on the one hand, they produce children, and that children becomes a nation. But Pharaoh wants to take the clay that they produce, that is their Hebrew children, and wants it destroyed. But God has another purpose for that clay. He wants it preserved to make a new nation.
Can I quote another one?
Do.
Found in Isaiah 45.
Okay, say it loudly.
Isaiah 40,
9.
45,
45.
verses 9 and 10.
9 and 10, okay.
It says, woe to the one who quarrels with his maker, and earthenware vessel among the vessels of earth. Will the clay say to the potter, what are you doing? Or the thing you're making say, he has no hands? And verse 10, woe to him who says to a father, what are you begetting? Or to a woman, to what are you giving birth?
Very good. I missed that one. Excellent.
Really good.
Say it again. Isaiah 45, 9 and 10, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, that even fortifies more my theory. Okay.
Two together.
Exactly. That this is not only a literal thing, but it's also typological. That just like Pharaoh tried to get them to kill the new lump of clay that came out of the potter's wheel, the birthing bench, but it didn't work. God took that clay and preserved it. And out of that clay, he made a new nation. Okay. I think it's provocative, at least. You decide. So now, so Pharaoh's plan was to, and I'll put it this way, mold Okay, the names of those two midwives. This is an image of light and life. And they ordered fellow midwives also to let these sons live. Now, this is not the only occasion of such a satanic plan. It's just an early one. What happens when we get to the book of Esther? We just celebrated Purim literally a week or so ago. What do we see again?
Attempt to massacre.
Exactly. We see an attempt by an evil man, okay,
Haman.
Haman, to devise a plan and to get the king of Persia to agree with it, which he did, to murder all the Jews in Persia. And yet it backfires. And the Jews live, and who dies? Haman. Okay. Now, one last example as we close. Okay. So, as I said, this plan was by Pharaoh was foiled by the midwives. And in verse 20, you see that the midwives are blessed for what they do. And they end up blessing also the Jewish families with this massive continued growth. Now, so I want to close by reminding you of two things. We go back over and over and over again to this very important verse in Genesis, chapter 3, verse 15. It talks about the seed of the woman and the seed of the thousands of years. We see it started very quickly with Cain and Abel, right? That the righteous is persecuted by the unrighteous and kills him. We see this through the example we just talked about in Exodus 1 about Pharaoh's intent using the midwives to kill the boys of the Jews, the young baby boys. And we see it in another interesting and remarkable place. And I'm going to read it to you. Matthew 2, starting verse 16. And when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged, and he sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem, in all of its environments, from 2 ages old and younger, according to the time which he had ascertained from the Magi. Here's the next one. Satan inspires Herod to try to kill the Christ child, the ultimate genocide, right? Okay. And then it says this, verse 17 and 18. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet, again, who we just quoted, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more. In verse 19, then of course Herod was dead, and the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph, saying to him, okay, it's now time to leave what country? Egypt, and to bring Christ home. So, a salvation even for the Messiah is found in Egypt, just like the salvation for the Jews begins in Egypt. So, that's the first chapter. We will continue next week. So, Stephen, would you pray for us to close tonight?
Lord, Father, Almighty God, I just want to thank you again so much for making this all possible and allowing us to come together tonight and study your word. I pray, dear Lord, Father, you lead us and guide us in everything we think, say, and do. And we give you all the praise and honor.
Yes.
Father, in Jesus Christ's holy, beautiful name. Amen.
Amen.